I'd like to start from a detail. I've noticed that here there is one of these small pieces that is erased. This one is not good. Is similar, very similar to the other one. So I asked him before that is like I was thinking that could be his work like a sort of pattern, where there is a store where he can choose his single pieces of work. I'd like 3 of this and 3 of this and 3. And he answered me, for each piece there is a difference in making, in color and so on. And this is what I think about like a sort of new Bauhaus. This idea of the use of a single, of a model, of a modulus, and then to build everything. But there is something else. There is something like the variability of life, of reality. In your work, there is something that is happening outside of your project, or not?
Well, I guess the Bauhaus comment, I think, now that I think about it, was a little bit reversed, because if we think about Bauhaus, it's this like kind of a situation where they're idealizing production in kind of a new sort of industrial age, like a post-industrial industrial age. So this idea of building modules that are infinitely reproducible, they're kind of with a kind of a socialist mechanism attached to it, I think is almost the opposite of what I'm doing, in the sense that obviously I'm working with multiples, and we're making them in a way that looks a lot like manufacturing sometimes, but each piece has to be individually shaped, and each piece of paper needs to be torn to create this curve here on this specific piece. And in that sense, they're so slow and they're so difficult to reproduce that's where they become interesting as cultural artifacts, because Bauhaus was incredibly successful in a certain sense when you think of, not maybe Bauhaus specifically, but the legacy of that way of thinking in terms of the way we think about products, or silverware, or plates, or chairs, or IKEA, and as an artist these days, you don't work like that, because even Jorge Pardo doesn't really work like that. So
each one of these are different from the other.
Well, yeah, by necessity. I mean, even if the paper is torn at the same time, the difference between the top piece of paper and the bottom piece of paper creates a difference. So they're all unique.
But conceptually, they have to be different.
It's important that they're different. I mean, we could have everything cut perfectly with a digital paper cutter, and it could be as close to exactly the same as possible. And I think that it's not interesting, because the difference is, as you can see, that as you move back through the piece, if you have 5 of these stacked on top of each other, each one is subtly different. So it's like if you painted the same painting 4 times.
So when we consider the cloud, that now
in the other room,
the cloud is similar. Is made by small pieces that seems all similar, but they are all different, of course.
They're all different. It's a little different because those are earlier, and I think that there's an offset print that's a component of it that was made from a drawing that's about this big. So the patterns themselves actually do repeat. What happened was the way that you cut the pattern creates the perception of changeability. So it looks like you have a lot more than you have.
Let's go to the cloud.
No, volevo soltanto velocemente tradurre. In realtà quello che si sono detti è, cioè quello che Jacob ha risposto a Marco è che gli elementi sono sì uguali, ma sono in realtà assolutamente diversi l'uno dall'altro, perché essendo fatti a mano ognuno ha una piccolissima diversità. e che deve essere così, cioè lui vuole che sia così, perché potrebbe fare in modo che facendo un disegno e tagliandoli digitalmente, cioè potrebbero essere quasi identici, mentre che non lo sono e volutamente non lo sono. Questo è proprio per dire brevemente quello che si sono detti prima.
Here, this idea of a cloud is for me is interesting about your work. Also to think about space. Here we are like in the typical white box, and the white box here is transformed because there are no more corner. There are your artwork is like an organism that is growing up. It's not like a project of a singular piece, but it's like indeed an organism that is going on the wall like a muffa. Like
a muffa.
A muffa is how do you say damp? What do you say when it's the damp
the
foam?
musk, like a muscular.
No, when it's no, not nebbia. It's muffa is when the damp creates like a dirt around something.
But is living. Is a living dust.
I should know the word.
Yeah, it's like a penicillin.
Oh, like a bacteria.
Yeah, something
that is like a strange organism that could like a blob.
Yes,
and this is for me in front of your previous artwork. For instance, this idea of space is increasing, it seems to me.
Well, I mean, these pieces, this is the beginning, really. You know, it all started with these kind of cloud-like blobs, if we want to talk about them that way. And I think that, when I think about kind of the creation of these forms, they're all based on a grid, so everything that I do is in kind of subversion to the grid. So to create an organic form in juxtaposition to this kind of rigid structure that's the foundation of it, I think that juxtaposition creates kind of an interesting, I don't know if you'd say tension, but an interesting dialogue between the foundation of the structure and the actual realization of the object. And I've always been interested in that, and as the work's kind of progressed, it's still very grid-based, and the idea is that I'm always just trying to subvert the grid and to push as far outside of the limits of that grid as possible, but the grid ultimately stops you, and it's like the room. You try to make these forms as organic as possible within the architecture of the box, or the Corrini Stampalia, this other kind of space, and that's the game. And you succeed or fail by virtue of how well you control the space and manipulate it and listen to it and kind of have this dialogue with it.
Cioè, allora, Jacob quello che dice è che queste installazioni sospese partono tutte in realtà da una griglia, da una forma precisa e che poi si sviluppano nello spazio. E Marco diceva che questi elementi
un organismo che più che un progetto, si parte da un progetto ma poi diventa un organismo che può diventare, che prende lo spazio e se lo mangia, come dire, no? Lo trasforma completamente.
Esatto, però è proprio quello che lui diceva, che parte da una struttura che è una griglia e poi dopo in realtà cerca di andare di spingere il più possibile, di uscire da questo schema così rigido.
But your artwork is like a relationship between the rationalism of a thought, of a single piece that of multiple and so on, and the possibility of the difference in growing and so on. Cioè, la differenza tra quello che è il razionalismo del pensiero e poi anche la casualità dello sviluppo.
Sì.
I think that there's probably some truth to that. I mean, these pieces, it's weird to talk about, this is such an early piece that we're standing under, so it's, the language and the kind of, in fact, meaning of the artwork has changed over the 15 years that I've worked on this, and this was maybe the third large piece that I ever built. And I think at the time, I wasn't really, it was almost like I really wanted to make landscapes. That was really the key, and I think that and it's interesting because this is installed as somebody 15 years later who is less interested in that and more interested in the kind of things that we're talking about in terms of the form and in terms of the spatial tensions and in terms of the way that pieces react and shape spaces. These pieces originally though came out of, and this piece in particular came out of painting, and it came out of this interest in the creation of certain kinds of marks that make landscape, and this idea of the limitation of this idea of when you're a painter and you're creating, you're like Gainsborough, for example, you're creating these huge, beautiful vistas. The idea is that you're creating, you're using atmospheric perspective, and you're creating a Bellini or whoever you want to talk about, and you're creating these infinite sorts of spaces. You're creating the planet within the picture, the limits of the picture plane. When you take that out of the picture plane and you're starting to create kind of sculptural landscapes, the limitations of the human effort to create those kinds of illusions are doubly reinforced. You can't let the picture plane wrap around you as easily because you're limited by your body, you're limited by the architecture, you're limited by all these things that are kind of real limitations on your experience. And I think that, as I was trying to achieve this sense of kind of vastness, the pieces got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and got room size. And then the idea was to just subsume the viewer in the kind of these masses, and and then I think as I worked on them more, you started seeing the possibilities of creating other kinds of spaces within them sculpturally that could do different kinds of things. So then we started thinking about them in terms of blobs, in terms of form, in terms of architectural interventions, and how that landscape vocabulary fits into kind of human-built spaces, which I think is really interesting. But it's a language that, when I was building this piece, I don't think I knew existed. So it's, I don't know, that's a little off topic, but it's
brevemente riassumo, quest'opera qui in realtà è una delle primissime opere che lui ha fatto, diceva che forse la terza grande installazione. Per cui lui in quel momento lì, in realtà, il suo pensiero era che lui voleva fare dei paesaggi, in realtà, ed è soltanto dopo che è subentrato in realtà il concetto di spazio e di quello che tu chiami muffa, diciamo, perché prima il suo desiderio era proprio di fare un paesaggio.
To transform a square room in a landscape is to change everything. is to change the space. It's not only,